Welcome to the Silent Personalities in 1787. James Madison basically described modern political polarization so perfectly that it sounds like he was watching Twitter, cable news, and election rallies in real time. But here's the scary part. He wasn't predicting the future, he was explaining human nature. And he warned that if we didn't build the right system, democracy would eventually turn into a battlefield of permanent factions. When people say James Madison predicted modern political polarization in Federalist No. 10, they don't mean he forecast today's parties, cable news, or social media by name. They mean he laid out a model of democratic conflict that maps cleanly onto what we now call polarization, durable camps organized around identity, ideology, and material interest, high emotional intensity, passion, and the risk that one camp, once it becomes a majority, uses power in ways that harm the rights of others or the long-term public good. Madison's starting point is the problem he calls faction. He defines a faction as a group of citizens minority or majority united by a shared impulse of passion or interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. That definition is basically a pre-modern description of what we now notice in polarized politics, when a side becomes primarily motivated by beating the other side or entrenching its own advantage rather than by rules that protect everyone over time. Importantly, Madison treats this as normal human behavior, not an occasional accident. He argues the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. In modern language, he's saying, don't design a political system that assumes people will be calm, unbiased, and civic-minded all the time, because they won't be. He then gives a very blunt diagnosis of why factions form and why they're so hard to eliminate. Differences in opinions are inevitable, so are differences in wealth, property, and economic position. Madison calls the various and unequal distribution of property the most common and durable source of factions, because it divides society into people with different stakes and priorities, owners versus non-owners, creditors versus debtors, etc. If you translate that to today, it's not hard to see parallels: economic cleavage, regional interests, cultural and religious differences, and status competition all provide stable fuel for political sorting. Polarization often looks like ideas, but it's usually ideas tied to interests and identities that people feel are threatened. Next comes the key logic move that makes Federalist No. 10 feel so modern. Madison says there are only two ways to address faction: remove its causes or control its effects. Removing the causes sounds attractive, but he argues the available methods are either unacceptable or impossible. The first is to destroy liberty, because liberty gives people room to form groups and pursue interests. He famously uses the analogy that liberty is to faction what air is to fire. Take away air, and you stop fire. But you also destroy something essential to life. The second method is to force everyone to have the same opinions and interests, which he calls impracticable because human reason differs, circumstances differ, and economic life produces different positions. If you're thinking about modern polarization, this is basically Madison saying you cannot fix polarization by trying to make citizens uniform or by suppressing disagreement without paying a massive cost to freedom. Disagreement is not a glitch, it's a feature of free society. So Madison focuses on the second approach, controlling the effects of faction. Here's where the prediction becomes especially relevant. He's most worried about majority faction, not minority faction, because a minority can be outvoted while a majority can legalize its will through democratic power. That is exactly the modern fear in highly polarized systems. Once one side controls enough institutions at once, it can change rules, entrench itself, punish opponents, or ignore minority rights, all while claiming democratic legitimacy. Madison's proposed solution is not get rid of factions, but structure the republic so factions can't easily become a unified, oppressive majority. His core claim is that a large republic and extended sphere does this better than a small one, because it contains more interests, more sects, more local attachments, and more economic variety, so it becomes harder for any single passion or interest to coordinate a majority that acts unjustly. In a small polity, the same intense passion can spread quickly and dominate. In a large one, the diversity and sheer scale complicate coordination and encourage coalition building across groups. This is a recognizable description of what political scientists later call pluralism: many organized groups competing, none permanently dominant, forcing bargaining and moderation. He also argues that a republic, meaning representative government rather than pure direct democracy, can refine and enlarge public views through elected representatives. The idea is not that representatives are saints, but that representation introduces friction and filtering. The public's immediate emotions are less likely to become instant law. There's time, deliberation, and the need to build support. In modern terms, he's building an antiviral design, slowing down the conversion of hot emotion into binding policy. If you take these pieces together, you can see why people say Madison anticipated polarization. He treats political conflict as inevitable, rooted in human psychology and social structure. He expects camps to form. He expects those camps to pursue self-interest and sometimes act against broader public good. And he warns that the biggest danger is when a majority can't become sufficiently unified to impose its will. That is a very close match to today's dynamics when politics hardens into two antagonistic blocks and governance becomes a zero-sum struggle. At the same time, it's important to be precise about what Madison did and didn't claim. He did not promise that a large republic would eliminate intense conflict. He promised it would make oppressive majorities harder to assemble and sustain, because diversity increases the number of competing interests and makes coordination more difficult. That's why Federalist No. 10 is often described as a theory of breaking and controlling the violence of faction, not a theory of harmony. The system is meant to channel conflict into bargaining rather than allow it to become domination. This is also where the modern polarization framing becomes interesting. Because it highlights a tension, Madison's mechanism works best. When society produces many cross-cutting factions, multiple, overlapping loyalties and interests. Polarization, by definition, is what happens when factions collapse into fewer, larger, more internally unified camps that line up across many issues at once. Madison's nightmare is basically a politics where one dominant passion or interest can unify a majority. Modern polarization is a politics that makes that unification easier because fewer mega coalitions cover everything. Federalist No. 10 gives you a language for describing that danger, even if the institutions don't always prevent it. So the deep takeaway is this: Federalist No. 10 is not just a pro-constitution essay, it's a theory of why free politics tends to produce camps, why those camps can become dangerous, and why institutional design should assume conflict and then manage it. Madison's prediction is that factional conflict is permanent, and that the job of constitutional structure is to prevent factional conflict from turning into injustice or instability, especially when a majority is animated by a shared passion rather than restrained by long-run public interest. And that's what makes Federalist No. 10 so unsettling. Madison wasn't writing about Democrats and Republicans. He wasn't talking about social media outrage, partisan news networks, or culture wars. But he understood something deeper. The moment a society becomes free, it will divide. People will form camps. They will defend their interests, and sooner or later, they will start believing that defeating the other side matters more than protecting the system itself. Madison's real genius wasn't that he thought factions could be erased. It was that he accepted they were inevitable and tried to design a republic strong enough to survive them. His warning was simple, but brutal. The greatest threat to democracy doesn't always come from kings, dictators, or foreign enemies. Sometimes it comes from inside, from a majority faction convinced that its victory justifies anything. And if Madison was right, then political polarization isn't a temporary crisis. It's a permanent pressure. The real question isn't whether factions will exist. The real question is whether the system we live in can still control their effects before they control the country.